The wind had a way of screaming through the Rocky Mountain foothills that made every living thing feel small. That afternoon, it whipped through my coat as if the fabric did not exist at all, slicing straight into my skin, carrying the warning of a storm that was about to swallow everything in its path. I had just left the discount grocery store in town, clutching a small paper bag of canned soup and instant oatmeal, the only things my remaining balance could cover. My EBT card had glitched again. The cashier announced it loudly, as if it were a public service to humiliate me. The man behind me chuckled under his breath and muttered something about people like me draining the system. A woman near the magazine rack shook her head and said I should not be shopping if I could not pay. I kept my eyes on my hands, apologized even though I had done nothing wrong, and left the bag of fruit I had planned to buy for the week behind. My daughter used to love fruit. I tried not to think about that as I hurried toward my old truck. By the time I reached the road leading home, snowflakes were already blowing sideways. The sky had turned a deep, bruised gray, the kind that swallows daylight long before sunset. I lived alone in a small cabin up the mountainside, a place that required chains on the tires and faith in the good graces of winter. Halfway up the road, the wind shifted sharply, carrying with it a sound so faint, I almost mistook it for the groan of a tree. But it was not a tree. It was a voice. A low, strangled cry swallowed by the storm. I stopped walking. The wind pressed against my back. For a moment, everything in me said to keep going. The storm was worsening. I could barely see the edge of the trail, but then it came again. A broken breath, a plea that barely existed in the world at all. I stepped off the road and into the deeper snow, pushing against the gusts until I reached a cluster of fallen branches near a drift. Something dark was buried beneath it. My heart slammed against my ribs. I dropped to my knees and brushed away the snow with my gloves. A hand emerged first, then a face. A man lay twisted on the ground, his skin pale with the grayish tint of someone who had been fighting the cold for too long. His hair was frozen at the ends, his clothes were torn, and his leg was bent at an angle that made my stomach turn. I shook his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyelids lifted just enough for me to see fear flash beneath them. His lips parted the words barely audible. "They left me to die." There were footprints around his body. More than one set, and one trail led away from him. Someone had been here recently. Someone who had chosen to walk away without looking back. A cold I could not blame on the storm seeped down my spine. I was a small woman and he was not a small man, but survival changes the math in your head. I slid my arms under his and heaved with everything I had, pulling him inch by inch through the deepening snow. Twice I slipped. Once I nearly fell on top of him. Each time I thought I would have to leave him there. But I kept going. I could not leave him. Not after hearing that voice hollow and broken begging the storm not to take him. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked like a blessing painted in amber. The windows glowed from the fire I had left smoldering that morning. I kicked the door open with my foot and dragged him inside. Warm air rushed over us like a miracle. I lowered him onto the old couch next to the fireplace, breathless and shaking. His body was ice cold, his fingers stiff with frostbite, his breathing shallow enough to make my throat tighten. I wrapped him in every blanket I had, then knelt beside him and checked his leg. The bone had not broken the skin, but it was close. His jaw clenched as a low sound escaped him. His eyes opened again and found mine. "I thought you were someone else," he whispered. His voice was sandpaper scraping against stone. He swallowed with effort. "They left me. They wanted me gone." His gaze drifted to the fire as if he were already slipping under again. I leaned closer. "Who left you?" His breath stuttered. A shadow. A man I trusted. Then his eyes rolled shut. I sat back, my pulse thundering in my ears. Whoever he was not just lost. Someone had meant for him not to survive, and I had just pulled him out of the grave they prepared. As I listened to the storm pound against the walls, I realized something I had no way of knowing when I knelt beside him in the snow. This stranger was not only fighting for his life, He was fighting a battle I did not understand, and by saving him, I had stepped straight into it. When he finally stirred the next morning, the storm had quieted into a soft whisper against the cabin walls, the kind of hush that always followed a night that tried to break everything in its path. I had barely slept, keeping an eye on the stranger on my couch as the fire burned low and the kettle hummed gently on the stove. His breathing had steadied during the night, but every so often he would flinch, as if fighting something inside his dreams. I was ladling hot broth into a cup when I heard a groan behind me. A rough, painful sound that made me turn quickly. He was pushing himself up on his elbows, one hand gripping the blanket as if the world were spinning around him. "Easy," I said, moving closer. "Your body is still in shock." He blinked several times, his eyes unfocused, then slowly settling on my face. There was confusion there, and something else too, an instinctive fear that came before memory. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse like he had swallowed gravel. I handed him the broth and kept my tone calm. "You are in my cabin. I found you in the snow near the ridge." His fingers wrapped weakly around the cup. The warmth seemed to surprise him, as if he had forgotten the feeling entirely. His gaze drifted around the small room, the wooden beams, the old rocking chair, the bundles of dried herbs hanging near the window. The place looked simple to most people, but to me it had always been a small shield against the rest of the world. He lifted the cup to his lips, then hesitated as if bracing himself for disappointment when he finally took a sip. Something softened in his expression. "Thank you," he whispered. "You saved my life." I bit the inside of my cheek because I did not know what to say. No one had said words like that to me in a long time, not with real gratitude behind them. He tried to sit up straighter, but pain shot through him so sharp it made his face twist. I knelt beside the couch and checked his leg. The swelling had gone down a little, but not enough. "You will not walk on that for days," I said. Firmly, his hand moved to his pocket, then froze. Confusion flared across his face. "My phone," he murmured, checking every fold of his torn jacket. "My wallet, my watch, all gone." He looked around the cabin again, but this time he was not looking at the walls. He was looking for danger, for threat, for answers. His jaw tightened. "Someone took them," I said quietly. He met my eyes, the fear in his own. So raw, I felt it in my chest. The wind slammed against the cabin door, making him jump. He was ready to fight, but his body betrayed him, collapsing back onto the pillows. I placed a steadying hand on his arm. "Do you remember anything I asked? Anything before you woke up here?" He stared at the fire for a long moment, as if trying to pull memories out of the flames. "I remember cold," he whispered, "a meeting somewhere near Fairview, a lodge. I think there was someone with me." Then he closed his eyes and his voice dropped. "Someone I trusted." I waited, but he did not continue, and when his eyes opened again, something in them had changed the sharpness of a man who was starting to understand just how much danger he might be in. He lifted the blanket slightly, examining his torn clothes. "These are expensive fabrics ruined by ice, wind, and blood. They did not match the life of a person who wandered mountains for fun." "Who are you?" I asked softly. His eyes flicked toward mine, and for a second he looked like a cornered animal. "I do not know," he said, though it sounded more like he was afraid to say the truth than incapable of remembering. I studied him. His hands were not the hands of a laborer. There were faint calluses from riding, not from swinging tools. His hair had been trimmed recently, his coat lined with real wool, his boots hand-stitched. Nothing about him fit the story of a man who should be abandoned in a storm. But his voice held a quiet, broken honesty that made me believe one thing. He needed help to survive whatever had happened to him. The fire popped loudly, making him flinch again. He watched the flames as if trying to anchor himself in the present. I brought more blankets and tucked them around him, then checked his temperature. His skin was still cold, but no longer icy. He noticed the care, and his throat dipped with a swallow. "Why did you help me?" he asked. The question was simple, but the weight of it pressed hard against the quiet room. No one had ever asked me that, as if kindness needed an explanation. I sat back on my heels and answered, "Because leaving you out there would have killed you, and I have seen enough things die in winter." He stared at me for a long time, then whispered, "I am not used to people doing something for nothing." The way he said it made my chest tighten, as if kindness was a language he had forgotten how to speak or never learned at all. He tried again to lift himself and winced. I placed my hand on his shoulder. "You need rest, Evan." He froze, staring at me. "How do you know that name?" I frowned, confused. "You said it last night." He shook his head slowly. Fear climbing his expression. "No, I did not." Felt my stomach drop, but before I could speak, he gripped the blanket like it was the only solid thing in his world. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Tell me everything I said in my sleep." As the storm rumbled outside, I realized something with a clarity that made the hairs on my neck rise. Whatever nightmare he came from had followed him into the mountains, and in saving him, I had just opened the door. That night, the wind screamed across the mountain like something alive, slamming against the thin walls of my cabin as if trying to claw its way in, and inside, the flickering firelight cast long, trembling shadows across Evan's face as he lay on the small cot near the hearth, his breathing shallow and uneven, and I remember thinking he looked nothing like the silent man who had barely spoken a word since I dragged him out of the snow, because now in the semi-darkness, something about him seemed younger, almost fragile, like a child lost in a nightmare he could not wake from. And when the storm outside hit a new, violent pitch, he jerked suddenly, his hand flying out as if reaching for someone who wasn't there. His voice cracking with a sound that sliced straight through my chest as he whispered, "No, don't sign it. Don't trust him. Please don't sign it." And at first I thought he was talking to me, until I saw the way his fingers curled into the blanket as though he were clinging to the last piece of something already being torn away from him, and I felt a coldness wash over me that had nothing to do with winter, because people who are simply scared of the storm do not talk like that in their sleep. People who merely got lost in the woods do not cry out like they are watching their entire world be stolen right in front of them. And before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched his shoulder gently, trying to bring him back to the present. But the moment my hand brushed his skin, he gasped and sat bolt upright with such raw terror in his eyes that I froze mid-movement. My breath caught somewhere between shock and pity as he looked around the room, wild and confused, like he expected someone else to be here, someone dangerous, someone who had been chasing him even into his dreams. And when he finally focused on me, the fear didn't vanish. It only shifted, becoming a quieter, deeper kind of dread, and he whispered my name. Not because he remembered it, but because he needed something real to hold on to. Like he feared he would fall apart completely if he didn't anchor himself to something safe. And for a long moment, neither of us spoke, while the storm outside roared like a beast circling a wounded thing. But then he lowered his head into his hands and whispered, "I remember a room and a paper and a drink, and then nothing." And the way his voice trembled made the hair on my arms rise, because there was something very wrong in the way he said nothing. Like it wasn't ordinary forgetfulness, but forced darkness, the kind of blackout that comes from chemicals and betrayal, and I sat down slowly on the wooden floor beside his cot, waiting for him to continue. Because I knew if I pushed too hard, he would shut down again, and after a long, shaking breath, he said I was not supposed to leave that meeting alive, and the words hung between us heavier than the storm clouds outside. And when he looked up at me, there was a haunted understanding in his eyes, like he was finally admitting something he had been trying not to face since the moment he woke up in my cabin, something that had been clawing at him from the edges of his fractured memory. And he whispered, "Someone wanted me gone," and I could see the pain of that truth slice him open in real time. Not just because he was almost killed, but because whoever did it was someone he had trusted, someone close, and the betrayal seemed to hurt him more deeply than the broken leg, or the frostbite, or the concussion ever could, and I felt something inside me tighten with a strange, fierce protectiveness. Because it is one thing to rescue a stranger from a storm, but it is another to watch a grown man crumble from wounds no one can see. And when he leaned back against the wall, staring at the fire as if it might give him answers, he whispered, "I heard someone behind me, before everything went black. And that was when the shadows outside the window shifted just slightly subtle enough that anyone else might have missed it. But I had lived on this mountain long enough to know when something moved that shouldn't have moved. And for a moment, I could swear I saw a dark figure pressed near the tree line watching my cabin before disappearing into the swirl of snow as fast as it had appeared, and I felt a chill roll down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold as I whispered, "Evan, did you come here alone?" And his eyes met mine with a hollow certainty as he said, "No, I think someone followed me, and in that moment I realized whatever storm I had pulled him from had only been the beginning, that the real danger wasn't the weather or the mountain or even the injuries he woke up with. It was the truth hunting him, the truth he was only beginning to remember." And as another violent gust shook the cabin, he whispered, "Clara, if they know I survived, they will come back." And I placed another log on the fire, pretending my hands weren't shaking, because deep down we both knew the storm outside wasn't the only one we would have to survive. The storm eased by morning, but the cold sharpened even more. A quiet, brutal stillness settling over the mountain, like the world was holding its breath, and inside the cabin, Evan tried to sit up on his own, wincing as pain shot through his injured leg, insisting he could help with the morning tasks, though he could barely lift the blanket without flinching. And I remember thinking how strange it was to watch a man who spoke like someone educated, who moved with a kind of restrained confidence, struggle with things so simple to me, like tying a bootlace or folding the wool blanket the right way. And when he reached for the firewood basket, he dropped the first log right on his foot and cursed under his breath with a mixture of shock and embarrassment, like it was the first time in his life a piece of wood had ever defied him. And I tried not to laugh, but he caught the smile tugging at my mouth and gave me this half-wounded, half-amused look that said he knew exactly how ridiculous he must seem. And I realized in that moment just how far apart our worlds truly were. Because the things I had done since childhood, hauling wood, chopping, kindling, mending the leaky roof, boiling water over a fire, were things he looked at as if I were casually performing magic right in front of him. And later, when I stepped outside to shovel the snow blocking the door, he insisted on helping again, limping out behind me, clutching a shovel like he had never touched one in his life. And it was almost painful to watch because every movement he made was awkward and too careful and too cold, as if he had never worked a day outdoors. And when he finally managed to push one scoop of snow aside, he looked at me like he expected praise, and I couldn't help but smile softly because he was trying, and that meant more to me than strength ever could. But then he shivered violently, his bare hands stinging red from the cold, and for the first time, I noticed the calluses on his palms were faint and soft, like hands that knew paperwork and phones and luxury steering wheels but not survival. And I guided him back inside, ignoring his weak protests, telling him he needed to rest or his body would give out before his memory returned. And inside, when the fire warmed his face back to color, he stared at the flames with this expression that wasn't sadness exactly, but something heavier. Something like longing, and I realized he didn't just feel out of place here, he felt ashamed of it, as if not knowing how to survive in a wooden cabin made him less of a man. So I said gently, "Not everyone is meant for life up here," and he didn't look at me, he just whispered, "I should be." And something in his voice made my heart twist, but the moment shifted when I cleaned up the small table and found something wedged under the edge of his torn coat. A watch, but not just any watch. A heavy limited edition piece I recognized from magazines when I was younger, one of those items only the ultra-wealthy owned, and I held it for a second, feeling the cold metal against my palm before asking, "Evan, is this yours?" And he froze like I had caught him doing something forbidden, his jaw tightening as he said, "No, it was my father's, the only thing he left me that wasn't money." And I didn't know what to say because for the first time since I found him, he looked angry not at me, but at life itself, like that watch carried every wound he never said out loud. And later, when the afternoon light filtered through the frost-covered window, and he tried again to help by mending a loose hinge on the door, he fumbled with the screwdriver so badly that I gently took it from him, and his face flushed a deep, embarrassed red, and he muttered quietly, "I'm not good at any of this, am I?" And I looked at him, truly looked, and saw a man who had probably been good at everything his whole life, because money and privilege had made the world bend around him, and now here he was, humbled by a loose hinge in a stranger's cabin. and I said softly, "You're doing your best, and that's enough." But he didn't seem convinced, and that evening, while I cooked a simple stew and the scent of herbs filled the warm air, he stared at the pot with an intense focus like he was studying some foreign skill and asked, "How do you know how much to add?" And I shrugged, saying, "I just know because this life was instinct for me, the same way wealth had been instinct for him." And after dinner, when he finally slept, I stepped outside to dump the dishwater into the snow and paused because across the clearing in the dim, fading light, I saw a faint set of footprints leading up the path, then vanishing into the trees. Not mine and not Evan's, because his steps could barely hold his weight. And as I stared into the silent woods, a prickling fear crawled up my spine. The same kind of fear I felt when I first heard him whisper in his sleep, "Please don't sign it," like someone was still out there waiting for him and watching my cabin. And when I came back inside, Evan had woken halfway, staring around with that same haunted confusion that made my chest tighten, and he whispered, "Clara, why does this place feel safer than anywhere I've ever been?" And I didn't answer because I didn't know whether he meant the cabin or me, or the fact that the world outside had nearly killed him. And as the fire snapped softly between us, I realized that no matter what he remembered later, no matter who he really was, our worlds had already collided in a way neither of us could reverse. And maybe that was what scared me most of all. Not our differences, but how quickly those differences were starting to feel like the smallest part of our story. By the next morning, the storm had softened into a steady, quiet snowfall, the kind that muffles the world and makes every sound feel heavier, more deliberate. And while I was washing out the stew pot from the night before, I heard it a low, distant thrum that didn't belong to the mountain. At first, I thought it was thunder, but thunder doesn't circle and it doesn't hover. And when the sound grew louder, rattling the metal cup by the sink, I stepped outside into the cold and saw it, a helicopter sweeping slow and wide, like it was searching for something or someone. And the moment I glanced back inside at Evan still sleeping near the fire, an icy chill moved through me, because the last time a helicopter came this far up the mountain was during a search and rescue mission, and right then I knew someone wasn't looking for a lost hiker. They were looking for him. But before I could even call his name, his eyes snapped open like he felt the vibration through the floorboards. He dragged himself upright too fast, grimacing in pain, and whispered, "Turn the lights off." His voice was sharp, desperate. Nothing like the calm, quiet man I had spoken to the night before, and I didn't ask questions, I just moved, shutting off the lamp and pulling the curtains closed while Evan pressed himself against the wall, breathing hard like an animal hunted, and I could see sweat beading at his hairline. Despite the cold, as the helicopter hovered low enough that snow shook loose from the cabin roof. Then after a long, agonizing minute, it veered away, disappearing back into the gray clouds, and Evan finally exhaled, collapsing back against the wall, his hands trembling, and when I knelt beside him, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He just whispered, "They are not trying to rescue me, Clara. They are trying to find out if I am still alive." And that sentence cracked something open inside me because until then, everything felt like fragments, a broken memory, a missing phone, a strange nightmare. But now the pieces began to click together in a way that made the hairs rise on the back of my neck, and I wanted to ask why, who. But before I could, he held up a shaking hand, asking for a moment, and his breathing steadied slowly, painfully, like he was holding something back. Something he wasn't sure he should tell me. And while he gathered himself, I tried to busy my hands so I wouldn't stare too hard at the fear written across his face. I went to fold the coat he had been wearing when I found him, and when I lifted it, something stiff slipped from the inside lining. A folded piece of paper stained with dried blood, the edges torn like it had been ripped in a struggle. And when I opened it, my heart dropped because it was a business document, a legal transfer sheet, reading in bold black letters, "Coal Energy Asset Transfer Meeting, 6 p.m., and below that, signatures lines one with Evan's name printed neatly and the other blank. And something about the paper made my stomach twist because it wasn't just important, it was urgent. And when I turned the document toward him, Evan looked at it like he had been punched in the chest, his face draining of color as he whispered, "I told them I would never sign it." his voice shaking with equal parts anger and betrayal, and he reached for the paper with hands that weren't steady, tracing the torn edge like he remembered the moment it was ripped from his grasp, and everything poured out of him in pieces, like a dam finally giving way. "I was at a meeting at the lodge," he said slowly. "My team was pressuring me to sign off on a deal that would push through a mining expansion. Too dangerous, too unethical, even for us. I refused. I told them it wasn't happening. Not while I was alive." He swallowed hard. "Then I remember someone pouring me a drink, someone I trusted, and I remember taking one sip before the room spun and someone caught me just before I hit the floor." And the way he said someone I trusted made my stomach turn because trust is rare and precious, and when it breaks, it cuts deep, and I asked quietly, "Evan, who did this to you?" But he shook his head, squeezing his eyes shut as if trying to force the memory to the surface, whispering, "I saw a face when I fell, but I didn't want to believe it because if it's true, then the betrayal is bigger than anything I ever imagined," and for a long moment, neither of us spoke the crackling of the fire. The only sound between us as the truth hovered just out of reach, but close enough to terrify us both. And then, as if the world wanted to confirm everything at once, the old battery-powered radio on my shelf crackled to life with a news update, the announcer's voice cutting through the cabin sharply. "A developing story this morning as CEO Evan Cole of Cole Energy has been reported missing. During the mountain storm, rescue teams are still searching. Authorities say foul play has not been ruled out," and my breath caught because hearing his name spoken out loud removed the last sliver of doubt, and I turned slowly to look at him. The man sitting in my cabin, half broken, half alive, and for the first time I saw the truth clearly. He wasn't just someone lost in the snow, he was someone else wanted gone, and Evan's eyes met mine full of guilt, as if he had kept a secret from me that he didn't think he deserved to share. And he whispered, "I didn't want you to know, because knowing puts you in danger too." And something inside me tightened painfully because danger wasn't new to me. The mountain taught me how to survive long before he stumbled into my life. But the idea that someone might come looking for him that someone already had made the air feel thinner, colder, as if the storm outside wasn't the only thing threatening us now. And he looked up at me, his voice raw and low, and said, "Clara, if they find out I'm alive, they will come back for me, and they will not stop at your door." And that was the moment the last piece of truth broke loose. The moment I realized saving him wasn't a single night's choice. It was a crossroads, and I had stepped onto a path I could no longer turn away from. The cabin felt smaller once the truth started pressing against its walls, like the storm outside had suddenly found its way indoors, and I could feel Evan watching me, even though neither of us said a word. For a long moment, the radio still crackled with static, like the world outside was whispering a secret too big for our tiny space. And part of me didn't want to ask the next question, because there are questions that change your life the moment they leave your lips. But the silence felt heavier than fear, so I quietly said, "Evan, is that really your name?" And the way he closed his eyes told me the answer before he ever spoke. His shoulders rose slowly, then fell, as if he were letting go of something he had been clinging to for too long, and when he finally looked at me, guilt flickered through his eyes like firelight dying. He whispered, "No," then added the name that I had heard on the radio, with a softness that made it sound like a confession rather than a declaration. "My name is Evan Cole, and even though I had already guessed, even though the pieces were all pointing in that direction, hearing him say it out loud still knocked the breath out of me because a name carries weight, and his carried billions of dollars, a corporate empire, and a life so far from mine, we might as well have lived on different planets. And I didn't know what to say at first. I just sat there, gripping the arms of the chair as if the wood might keep me rooted to the floor of a world that had suddenly shifted under my feet. "You're Cole Energy," I whispered. "You're the Cole they've been talking about for months. The one responsible for half the jobs in the state. The one on every billboard. The one whose face was all over the news when the clean drilling initiative fell apart." And he let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Yeah, that's me." But he said it like he despised the man everyone else praised, and he looked away, rubbing his hands together the way people do when they're trying to keep something inside from spilling out. "I didn't tell you because for a moment I got to be just Evan. No meetings, no shareholders, no one wanting something from me, no pressure to be perfect. Just a broken man in a storm being helped by someone who didn't want anything in return. I didn't know how badly I needed that until you gave it to me. His voice cracked slightly, and I could feel something deep in my chest shift, but I forced myself to stay focused, because the truth wasn't just emotional, it was dangerous. So I asked the question that mattered most: who tried to kill you? And this time, he didn't hesitate. Jonathan, my assistant, the one person I trusted with everything. He ran my schedule. He signed documents in my absence. He handled every deal I didn't have time for. I let him into every part of my life. And when he said this, you could hear the betrayal sharp and quiet, like a knife sliding through cloth. He drugged me at that meeting. Clara, he planned the storm. He planned the timing. He stole my phone and my wallet, and my watch left me in that snow, knowing no rescue team could reach me before hypothermia did, and the way he said knowing made my skin crawl, because Evan wasn't just describing a plan. He was describing a man who understood him intimately enough to predict every move he would make, and when someone knows you that deeply, they know exactly where to strike. Then I remembered the helicopter, and I asked, "Why didn't you want them to land?" And Evan's eyes darkened. "Because they weren't here to save me. Clara, they were here to confirm whether I was dead." They needed certainty, and if I had crawled out of the snow, if I had found help, if I had survived somehow, then they needed to end what they started on their terms, not mine. That was when something inside me snapped, a kind of protective anger I didn't know I was capable of, because no one should have to fear being found alive. And while the storm pressed against the windows, Evan reached into the coat I had folded earlier, pulling out something I hadn't noticed before: a small, portable charger flickering with 1% battery left. He plugged in his phone, and we both held our breath as the screen lit up, showing missed calls, dozens of them from board members, lawyers, company contacts. And then one final unsent message, typed but never delivered to Jonathan. It read, "You will not win," and seeing those 4 words, typed by a man who had expected to die, made my throat tighten. But then another notification appeared, a news post with Evan's face beneath the headline. "Coal Energy Board considers emergency vote to replace missing CEO." And that was when Evan whispered the truth that tied everything together. "Clara, if I don't go back, they will take everything: my company, my legacy, my voice, my life, and the people who trusted me will be crushed. And the worst part is, if I return unprepared, they will finish what they started." And it hit me. Then he wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for something much bigger. Something he had spent years building, something people depended on, and that realization terrified me, because part of me wanted to tell him to stay hidden, to stay here, to let the outside world tear itself apart without him. But another part knew he would never survive living with that kind of surrender. His spirit would die long before his body ever did. Then he looked at me and asked the question that made my heart stop. "Clara, do you want me to stay, or do you want me to fight?" And I hated that question, because it wasn't fair. It forced me to choose between safety and truth, and both felt like losing. But when I looked at him, when I saw the man beneath the billionaire, the man who had cried in his sleep, who had trusted me with the broken pieces of his past, who had looked at my small cabin like it was the first real home he had ever seen, I knew my answer. "You have to fight, Evan," I whispered, but not alone. And when I said, "not alone," his entire body went still, like the sentence had reached a place inside him no one else ever had. He nodded once slowly and said, "Then I need to leave soon, but I promise you I'll come back." And even though promises are fragile, things easily broken by fear or fate or distance, I believed him because of the way he said it. Soft, certain, like a vow carved into something stronger than time. And for the first time since the moment I found him in the snow, I realized I wasn't just trying to keep him alive, I was becoming part of the reason he wanted to live. The days after Evan revealed who he truly was felt strangely quiet, like the mountain itself was pausing, holding its breath, watching him decide what kind of man he wanted to be. And even though the storm outside softened, the tension inside him burned, and I could feel it every time he looked at the compass he had taken from the coat pocket, the one he kept turning between his fingers like he was trying to understand what direction his life was pointing to. Now he didn't talk much after that night, but he acted differently, and that was how I first knew the mountain was changing him. Not by witnessing some dramatic confession or some grand gesture, but by watching the subtle ways he let himself become someone he had never been allowed to be before. On the first morning, he insisted on gathering firewood with me, even though I told him his leg needed rest. He limped behind me, stubborn, determined, dragging a small sled of logs because he refused to stay inside. Feeling useless, he dropped the pile twice, wincing each time, but never once complained. He just kept saying, "I want to earn my stay," and I didn't know how to tell him that I had never let anyone earn anything here. The cabin was built for survival, not transactions, and when I cooked, he asked to learn pushing his sleeves up clumsily, chopping vegetables in uneven chunks while muttering, "Why is cooking harder than running a company?" And I laughed for the first time in days, and it wasn't the kind of laugh you give out of politeness. It was the kind that loosens ribs and lifts a weight off your chest, and when I looked at him, he wasn't the billionaire on TV. He wasn't the missing CEO, plastered on digital billboards. He was just a man with hair falling over his forehead trying not to cry while cutting onions. He burned the soup twice over. Salted. Everything nearly dropped a pot on his foot, and yet he kept trying. Watching me, carefully copying my movements like a student learning life for the first time one evening after dinner, he sat on the floor, sharpening wood for kindling, and said quietly, "My father never taught me any of this. He used to tell me survival skills were for people who had nothing to lose." And I realized then how different our worlds truly were, not in the ways that money could measure, but in the ways that shaped hearts. One world molded him into a man who knew how to build empires, but not how to light a fire. The other molded me into a woman who could survive any storm, but had no idea how to let someone stay. And somewhere in between those two worlds, we found a fragile space where both of us could breathe. He asked to join me, checking the snare traps, and even though I warned him about the terrain, he insisted, saying if I could survive the snow, then I could survive this. He was wrong. He slipped 3 times the first hour, once catching onto a branch so dramatically that I had to hold his coat to stop him from falling flat into the snow. And instead of blaming the ice or the terrain, he looked at me breathless, laughing, and said, "So, this is what real life feels like," and I didn't say it then, but I thought it real life was finally reaching him for the first time. We sat by the river after pulling up the fishing line, the cold biting at our cheeks. Evan staring at the frozen water like it was showing him a version of himself he had never met before. He said, "Clara, I spent my whole life surrounded by people, but I have never felt less lonely than I do here with you." And I should have said something, but the words froze in my throat because feelings like that sneak up on you quietly, slow as snow accumulating on a roof, until suddenly it is too heavy to ignore. Then came the morning he brought me something unexpected. I walked into the kitchen and saw him standing by the counter holding a wooden spoon carved roughly unevenly, obviously made by someone who had never carved anything in his life. "I made this for you," he said, looking almost embarrassed. "It is terrible, but I wanted you to have something that came from my hands, not my money, not my company, just me, and I swear." Something inside my chest trembled because gifts in my life had always been practical, predictable. Never something that held someone's heart inside it. But before I could thank him, before I could even touch it, the door blew open with a violent gust of wind, and snow swirled into the cabin like a warning, a sign that something was shifting, and for a moment neither of us moved. The wind pressing cold against our skin, like a reminder that peace never lasted long on this mountain, and the next morning when I woke up, the first thing I felt was the unfamiliar emptiness of a space that should have held someone else. The fire was burning low, the wooden spoon still on the counter, the sled missing, Evan gone. At first, I stood in shock, staring at the open space near the door, as if expecting him to step back inside. Smiling, carrying firewood, or mumbling about another recipe he wanted to ruin, but the stillness told the truth. He had left without telling me, without waking me, without asking me to come, and for women like me, people leaving was not new. But somehow his absence felt different, sharper, colder than the winter air outside, and I found a note tucked under the compass on the table. "Clara, I have to fix what broke us. I cannot stay, knowing the people who tried to kill me are still free if I return and you never hear from me again. Please know you saved my life more than once." And I read the note 3 times. feeling something like panic rising beneath my ribs because I had spent so many years believing that nothing truly belonged to me, nothing truly stayed, but now losing him felt like losing a piece of myself. I didn't know I had found, and for the first time I realized the mountain had not just changed him, it had changed me too, and that terrified me more than any storm ever had. When I finally stepped outside the cabin that morning, the snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes, the kind that made the world feel too quiet, too still, almost like the mountain was holding its breath. And as I stood there staring at the empty trail where Evan should have been, something inside me sank. With a weight I had spent years pretending I was immune to the kind of ache that grows only when someone leaves without saying goodbye, the kind that feels like a door slamming shut in the cold. I tried to tell myself he must have had a reason, that maybe he had just gone to gather wood or check the traps, but the sled was gone. The tracks were fresh, and his coat, the thick winter one I had forced him to wear the first night he arrived, was missing from its usual hook by the door, and that was when the truth hit me hard enough to steal my breath. He had left, really left, and I stood there, gripping the edge of the doorway, fighting the sting in my chest because people walking away was not new to me. I had lived through abandonment more than once, and I thought I had built armor strong enough to keep those old wounds from tearing open again. But Evan leaving felt different because I had never let anyone stay long enough to matter. Not until him, I walked back into the cabin, the silence louder now, picking up the wooden spoon he carved the day before, the one that was uneven and rough on the edges but made with more sincerity than anything money could buy, and I held it tightly, trying to understand why this small piece of wood felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Maybe because it was the first thing anyone ever made for me, simply because they wanted to. Not because they owed me, not because they pitied me, not because they had something to gain. I found the compass under his letter, the one he had pressed into my palm just days earlier, telling me it was meant to point him toward home. And now the irony made my stomach twist, because it felt like he had taken the entire meaning of that compass and walked away with it, leaving me in the middle of nowhere, with a cabin full of missing warmth and a heart full of unanswered questions. I sat at the table and read his note again, tracing the handwriting that was firm, steady, determined Clara. I have to fix what broke us. I cannot stay, knowing the people who tried to kill me are still free. If I return and you never hear from me again, please know you saved my life more than once. I will come back if I can. And those last 3 words, if I can cut deeper than anything else, because they told the truth. He was heading into danger, into a world I did not understand, a world where powerful men disappeared and no one asked questions. A world where money could kill just as easily as it could save. Hours passed, and I kept moving through the cabin like a ghost, chopping wood, hauling water, forcing myself to work so I would not collapse under the weight of not knowing whether he was alive or freezing somewhere in the storm. But every small sound made me look toward the door, hoping, praying that maybe he would walk back in with his hair full of snow and some ridiculous excuse about wanting to surprise me. But the door stayed closed and the mountain stayed quiet, and as night fell, the shadows stretched long against the floor, making the cabin feel emptier than it had since my parents died. I tried to convince myself he left because he had to, not because he wanted to, that he was protecting me, not abandoning me. But even then, doubt seeped in like meltwater through cracked wood. What if he realized he did not belong here? What if he returned to the world he came from with its glass towers and polished boardrooms and forgot all about the girl who dragged him out of the snow like a lost wolf pup? What if saving him meant nothing in the world he really belonged to? But just when I was ready to surrender to the cold ache settling in my bones, the dogs outside began to bark a deep echoing warning, and at first I thought maybe Evan had returned, maybe the universe had decided to give me mercy. But when I opened the door, it was not Evan standing there. It was a man I had never seen before, tall, wrapped in a thick black coat lined with fur. His face sharp and composed, with the polished look of someone who had never chopped wood in his life. And for a moment, fear curled hard in my stomach, because strangers arriving in the middle of a snowstorm never meant anything good. He removed one glove slowly, like this was a business meeting and not the middle of the wilderness, and said, "Miss Hayes." I nodded, though my heart hammered harder with every second he reached inside his coat and pulled out an envelope sealed tightly with a wax mark. A mark I recognized from Evan's documents, the symbol of coal. "Energy, this is from Mr. Cole," the man said, voice crisp and formal. "He asked me to bring you to him." My breath caught. The envelope was warm, as if it had been tucked close to his chest for hours. My fingers trembled as I slid it open and saw Evan's handwriting. "I am safe, but not finished. I need you to trust me one more time if you can. I am sending for you, not because I want to pull you into danger, but because I do not know who to trust anymore except you. You saved me from the storm. Now, I need you in the storm I am walking into. Please come to Denver." I felt the world tilt slightly because for weeks I had imagined him disappearing like everyone else I had lost, but here he was reaching for me again, even from miles away, even from a world filled with danger and betrayal, even from a place I did not belong. The man gestured toward the waiting sled, the dogs restless, the air thick with falling snow. "We leave in 10 minutes. Miss Hayes." I looked back at the cabin, the place that had been my entire world for so long. The place where I found him, the place where he changed and where I changed, and I realized then that maybe my life was bigger than this mountain. Maybe I was allowed to want more than survival. Maybe I was allowed to choose someone who had chosen me, even when the world around him tried to take everything away. I slipped the compass into my coat pocket, grabbed my boots, and stepped outside into the storm, ready to follow the tracks he left behind, because for the first time in my life, someone had left but wanted me to follow. The city hit me like a wall the moment the car turned onto the downtown avenue. The buildings rose like glass mountains, each one reflecting sharp blue light and neon ads, and people moving so fast they did not even notice themselves. And somewhere between the chaos and the bright steel, I realized I was not prepared for Evan's world. Not even a little. The last time I stood among buildings taller than trees was when I was 18 and running away from the life that had already collapsed beneath my feet. But now I was here because a man I had known for only a small sliver of my life had written 2 sentences that changed everything. "I am safe and I need you." The driver, a man with a stiff jaw and a black coat, opened the door for me in front of a towering skyscraper. Its marble steps swept clean, despite the snowstorm swirling around us. "Miss Hayes, this way," he said, and I stepped out, gripping the compass in my pocket. The compass that now pulsed in my hand like a heartbeat. The lobby inside was a world I had only seen in movies. Cold-polished elegant, lined with gold trim and tall glass windows, the kind of place where the wood in my boots felt too rough and my coat too old. People in suits glanced at me as I walked past, some curious, some confused. One woman whispered something under her breath and looked me up and down as if measuring how out of place I was. And she was right. I did not belong here. Not with these people, not with this world. But then the elevator doors opened, and there he was. Evan standing tall in a charcoal suit, leaning slightly on his uninjured leg and looking at me with an expression that made the entire towering lobby disappear. "Clara." He breathed my name like he had been holding it in his chest since the night he left, and before I could speak, he stepped forward, pulling me close just enough that I felt the warmth of him through the cold, still clinging to my coat. "I am sorry I had to leave like that," he murmured. "I am sorry for everything." I wanted to yell that sorry was too small of a word for what the last week had felt like. But when I looked into his face, I saw everything he had carried alone: grief, fear, guilt, determination, and something else. Something that softened the hard lines of his jaw and made my stomach twist. He stepped back but did not let go of my wrist and said, "Come with me. There is something I need you to see." He led me through the elevator into the upper floors of Cole Tower, straight into the world that had tried to kill him. Not metaphorically, but quite literally. Conference rooms full of silent men in dark suits, offices lined in cold steel, and numbers screens of stock markets blinking harsh red and green. One room held a long polished table where a group of board members sat whispering behind their hands, and every pair of eyes shifted toward me as Evan guided me to stand beside him. "Evan," one of them said, her tone clipped formal. "We were not informed you would be bringing a guest. This is Miss Hayes," Evan said evenly. The woman's lips tightened. "I do not believe this is an appropriate environment for visitors." Evan's jaw flexed. "She is here because she belongs here with me." The room fell silent, a few. Eyebrows raised a few glances, exchanged a few looks, sharpened into judgment. That familiar sting hit my chest, but I lifted my chin, refusing to shrink. Evan placed a hand lightly against my back and leaned in, whispering, "They are not your judges, and they are not mine anymore." After leaving that room, Evan guided me through the quieter upper hallway, stopping in front of a door with his name printed in gold. Evan Cole, CEO. And even though I knew now who he was, seeing it spelled out like that made my breath catch. He opened the door, letting me step inside first, and the office that unfolded before me was nothing like the cabin. It was wide open, framed with glass and steel. A view of the entire city laid out like a map below us, desks, stacks of documents, screens flashing data, and yet despite all the wealth, all the power, the first thing I noticed was something small on his desk. The wooden spoon he carved in the cabin placed right beside a fountain pen, worth more than my entire home. Evan noticed my lingering gaze and gave me a soft, almost shy smile. "I brought a piece of your world into mine," he said quietly, "so I would remember what matters." I swallowed hard, unable to trust my voice. "Just yet." He walked to the window, staring out at the skyline, then said, "Clara, I spent the last week fighting for my company, fighting for my name, fighting to put the man who betrayed me behind bars. But I realized something during every meeting, every court filing, every confrontation he turned to me, his eyes darker than the storm I pulled him from. I realized the only person I wanted beside me through all of it was you." The words struck something deep, something raw, because no one not once had ever said they needed me for anything other than duty, survival, or circumstance. But Evan said it like it was the truest thing he had ever known before. I could respond. The office phone rang sharply, slicing the moment Evan's assistant, the one he trusted before Jonathan stepped inside, looking rattled. "Sir, they confirmed it. Jonathan Reed is entering the building now." Evan stiffened, every muscle in his shoulders tightening, and in that second, I understood this was not just business. This was a confrontation he had been preparing for. Since the night he woke up on my couch, he turned to me, holding my gaze. "Clara, you asked me once why I survived that night." I nodded. Evan took a breath, steady but shaken. "I survived because of you, because your hands pulled me out of the snow, because your fire kept my body warm, because your voice was the first place I heard safety. I survived because I had something worth coming back to. The elevator dinged, outside, footsteps approaching. Hard, determined, Evan reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. "Clara, whatever happens after this, just know, none of this means anything. Without you." Those footsteps grew louder, pounding against the marble hallway, sending a shiver up my spine as he tightened his grip and whispered, "Stay beside me, please." And as the door swung open and the storm he had escaped finally walked back into his life, I stood right there next to him, ready to face it too. The moment the door slammed shut behind Jonathan, the room went heavy with a silence so sharp it almost cut through the air. Evan's shoulders were rigid, his jaw tight, but his hand stayed wrapped around mine as if anchoring himself to something that would not shift under him. He did not speak. Not at first, just stared at the closed door like every memory he had been trying to bury had forced its way back upward. He finally exhaled slowly, the breath shaky. "Clara, come with me." He led me out of the office, down a quieter hallway through a side elevator and into a private conference room overlooking the city. He locked the door behind us, then leaned against the wall, pressing his palms into his eyes like someone trying to steady a world that would not stop spinning for a long moment. He said nothing, then, in a voice so low it barely reached me, he said, "I should have told you sooner." I stepped closer, unsure if touching him would break him open or hold him together. He looked up at me, and for the first time I saw the truth. Not the composed CEO, not the calm strategist, not the man who had stood before a boardroom with iron in his spine. This was Evan stripped bare. He moved to the window, staring down at the city far below. Then he spoke quietly. I grew up in a house where silence was the definition of love. Clara, my father believed emotions made men weak. My mother. He stopped swallowing hard as if the memory itself scraped every inch of him raw. My mother lived in her own world behind therapy doors, pills that dulled her down, and a glass of wine always in her hand. She was alive but never present. He pressed his fingertips to the glass window like he was reaching toward something he never had. I used to stand in front of her and ask her questions about my day school, anything just to get a reaction. Sometimes she would blink and look at me like she didn't recognize her own son. His voice cracked slightly, and it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't exaggerated. It was the quiet truth of a child who grew into an adult without ever hearing a single sentence of real affection, Clara. I don't think she ever told me she loved me, not once. My heart burned hot and cold at the same time I stepped closer, my voice soft. Evan, what about your father? He let out a humorless breath. My father believed love was a distraction, affection was a flaw, and the only way to prove your worth was to outperform everyone alive. He trained me for business before I could even spell business. Reading market charts at 7, analyzing risk by 10. I was a machine, not a son. He looked at me then, and the weight in his eyes nearly brought me to my knees. Do you know, the first time my father touched my shoulder, I shook my head, expecting a childhood memory instead. He whispered, "Graduation day." He congratulated me on beating the son of his business partner. Nothing else. Evan's eyes glistened, but he blinked the tears back, refusing to let them fall, not out of pride, but out of habit. After a long breath, he continued, "When you grow up believing, survival is only possible if you never need anyone. You forget how to be human when someone actually cares for you." His voice broke there. I did not move or speak. I let him fall apart in the quiet. He had never been allowed to feel. Before, he rubbed the back of his neck, pacing once, then twice before stopping in front of me, his hands shaking so subtly it made my chest ache. "Clara, I know you saw the headlines, the missing CEO, the billions, the boardroom power, but none of it feels like mine." Not really. And when I vanished that night when Jonathan tried to get rid of me, I realized something terrifying. If I died, no one would grieve. Not really. They would just replace me, reposition the company, and move on. He swallowed hard when I woke up in your cabin. You were the first person in my entire life who looked at me without expecting something, without calculating, without wanting anything from me. You just wanted me to live, and I did not know what to do with that kind of goodness. I reached for his hand, and he let me take it slowly like he was giving me something breakable. "Clara," he said softly, "I am not proud of the man I was before the storm. Money made me cold, fear made me guarded, and loneliness made me numb. But with you, you made me feel like a person worthy of warmth again." I exhaled painfully because no one had ever spoken to me that way, either. Evan didn't stop. He stepped closer, his forehead nearly touching mine when you held me after the nightmares, when you taught me how to split firewood, when you fed me the soup you apologized for, even though it saved my life. I felt something I have never felt in any boardroom, any skyscraper, any relationship I ever tried to build. I felt safe. I closed my eyes just for a second, letting the truth sink into me warm and heavy and terrifying. He whispered, "You are the only place I have ever felt safe. Clara and I don't want to lose that." I opened my eyes and met his gaze fully, and for the first time I let him see the wounds I never let anyone else see. Evan, I said quietly, "You weren't the only one who grew up without love." Then the memories of my winters alone, losing my parents, scraping through hunger nights, patching the same coat for years, flooded back, and Evan listened the way no one ever had. My voice trembled, but I kept speaking because this moment demanded truth. I know what it feels like to freeze on the inside, to survive on grit alone, to never expect softness from anyone. And that is why I helped you on that mountain, Evan, because I know what it's like to need saving, even when you don't know how to ask. He closed his eyes, and one single tear slid down his cheek. Silent, almost invisible, except to me, the room stayed still. The city humming far below us, and in that fragile heartbeat, we were just two broken people who had carried too much for too long. I placed my hand on his cheek and whispered the one thing he had never heard you deserved. Love long before you met me. Evan, his breath shuddered against my palm, and he leaned into it like a man who had walked through storms his entire life, finally finding a place to rest, and for a brief suspended moment, neither of us spoke the truth between us, finally too real to deny. He finally whispered, Clara, there is a gala tomorrow night. I want you there with me. And I know people will talk and judge and look at you like you do not belong, but I will stand beside you through all of it if you let me. His voice dropped even softer. I want the world to know who saved me. I want them to see the only person who made me want to live differently. And that was where part 10 ended, with his hand over mine, his forehead against mine, and the storm outside the window finally losing its strength. The night of the gala arrived with a kind of brightness I had never seen before. The kind that made every window in the skyscrapers glow like the world was on fire, and every street reflected gold back up at the sky. I had never been in a place so polished, so loud, so overflowing with money that the very air felt expensive. The black car Evan sent waited outside the hotel, and when I stepped in, I felt every insecurity I had tried to bury claw its way back up my throat. I tugged at the simple navy dress I wore, borrowed from his assistant, who said it would fit me. I felt like an imposter wrapped in someone else's life, someone else's world. When the car stopped in front of the Grand Marlowe Hotel, I froze. Chandeliers the size of my cabin hung inside the entrance. Glass taller than pine trees, polished marble floors reflecting the bright lights, and too many people gliding through the room like they were born, knowing how to be admired. Evan was waiting near the entrance, dressed in a charcoal suit, tailored so perfectly it looked like it was cut from shadow itself, but the moment he saw me, the entire world fell away from his eyes. He stepped forward, took my hands, and breathed, Clara, you look like the reason winter melts. I felt my stomach twist, because I wasn't used to praise. Not dressed up, not dressed down, not ever, I whispered. You sure I belong here? Evan didn't hesitate 1 second. You belong wherever I am, and tonight that is right beside me. He offered his arm, and I took it, even though my hands were shaking. The cameras outside flashed violently as soon as we stepped onto the carpet, a sea of voices shouting questions. Evan Cole, are you officially back at the helm of Cole Energy? Mr. Cole, who is she? Evan didn't even look at them. Instead, he leaned in and murmured, just walk with me like you did on the mountain. One step at a time inside the ballroom, the ceiling glittered with thousands of crystal droplets like falling ice suspended in midair. The music swelled soft strings weaving above the low hush of conversation. Evan guided me through the crowd, hand warm at the small of my back. Every touch quiet and grounding, but I still felt eyes on me, hundreds of them, measuring me, comparing me, judging me. I heard whispers. She looks so plain she is definitely not from here. Where did he find her? I kept my face forward, but every word scraped against something raw inside me. And then, like a blade sliding through silk, a woman's voice floated from behind us, smooth, deliberate, dripping with cruelty. I suppose this year's charity project is a mountain girl. Evan stiffened next to me. I turned. The woman was tall, elegant, beautiful in a cold, sculpted way, the kind of woman who never learned humility because no one ever demanded it. She looked at me with a smirk, thin and cutting temporary entertainment. I assume. Evan, Clara, excuse me. She laughed lightly as if sharing a private joke with herself. Big men always get bored of the wilderness. They always come home. I felt something deep inside me fold in on itself, a familiar ache, the one that whispered, I didn't belong anywhere, not in his world, not really, not enough before I could walk away. Evan's voice cut through the music, sharp and cold. Enough, the room stilled, every face turning. He stepped in front of me, shielding me from every stare, and his voice carried with a strength I had never heard from him. You do not get to speak about her, he said, not to her, not to anyone. The woman blinked, taken aback. Evan moved to the stage, climbed the steps with purpose, and faced the entire room with a calm that quieted every whisper. I stood, frozen, as he took the microphone, adjusting it with hands that did not shake. He scanned the crowd, and then his eyes found mine. I did not expect him to speak about me to anyone, certainly not an entire room full of powerful people, but he did. Clara, he said clearly, her name wrapping around the room is the reason I am alive tonight. The room shifted, murmurs rising and falling. Evan continued, I did not disappear in December because of business or travel or stress. I disappeared because someone tried to remove me from this world for their gain. Gasps rippled through the room. I survived because a woman who owed me nothing found me broken, barely breathing, left for dead in the snow, and brought me into her home knowing it might cost her everything. He looked at me again, his voice softer but just as steady. I was not saved by my wealth, my title, or my company. I was saved by her kindness, her grit, her courage, by a woman who had every reason to walk away but didn't, because she has something. No amount of money can buy a soul that chooses goodness, even in its own hardship. My throat tightened. He wasn't finished, and tonight some of you looked at her like she was less than, like she was beneath this room, beneath me, beneath all of you. He shook his head. That ends now. I will not stand in a room that mocks the woman who saved my life, who saved the man beneath the title, who gave me a chance to be human again. His voice lowered, but it echoed through every corner of that glittering ballroom. If anyone here wants to question her worth, you answer to me first. The room erupted in stunned silence. No applause, no whispers, only shock, pure and heavy shock. Evan stepped away from the mic, walked straight toward me, each step slow and deliberate as if he was crossing more than a ballroom floor. He stopped in front of me, took my face in his hands, and said quietly but firmly, I will never let the world belittle you again, Clara. I swallowed hard, tears gathering against my will. I whispered, Evan, you didn't have to do that. He shook his head. I did because I will not ask you to walk into my world unless I am willing to change it for you. And he kissed my forehead, soft, warm, certain of vow in the shape of a touch, and in that moment, for the first time in my life, I was not invisible, not unwanted, not out of place. I was seen. I was defended. I was chosen. The first snowfall of the next winter came early, soft powder drifting from the sky like feathers shaken loose from a giant pillow, the kind of quiet white that makes the whole world pause and breathe suddenly slower. I stood outside my cabin, stacking the last of the firewood for the night, watching the distant ridge turn silver under the settling snow a year ago. I had dragged a stranger out of a storm half dead, half frozen, and completely unaware that he would upend my life in every way imaginable. Now the mountain felt different, the cold less sharp, the silence less lonely. It was no longer just a place I survived. It was a place someone was choosing to return to. Footsteps crunched behind me, the steady, confident kind that still made my heart react before my mind caught up. When I turned, Evan was there, carrying a crate of supplies, like it weighed nothing, even though I knew he still winced sometimes from the old fracture. Under all the snow, he called out. Careful, you are starting to look like you enjoy manual labor. I snorted. Do not flatter yourself, city boy. He set the crate down, his breath forming small white clouds in the air last year. You said I would never manage mountain chores. Now you are trusting me with firewood. I shrugged. Well, you have not set anything on fire in at least 2 months. He laughed, the sound warm enough to melt the frost between us. Then he bent down, grabbed a log, and placed it onto the stack, aligning it perfectly. I raised an eyebrow. Perfectionist. Much. He glanced up. Only for you, Clara. I looked away too quickly, pretending to check the woodpile, even after a year of him being in my life. After courtrooms and speaking engagements, after late-night conversations that stripped every wound bare, after watching him walk away from an empire he built, and then walk back toward a life we built together. Even then, even now, the way he said things sometimes struck some unguarded part of me, and I felt myself soften in ways that scared me and healed me at the same time. Evan brushed his gloves and said, She will hold together this winter. She always does if we keep at it. I was about to answer when he added softly, But she is not the only one who has needs. And suddenly he touched my hand, a brief, quiet, warm thing, a reminder, a grounding. I met his eyes. It had taken us months to learn each other, how to argue softly, how to listen deeply, how to give space, and how to reach across it. We had not rushed, we had not forced, we had rebuilt ourselves slowly, the way one learns to breathe again after cold air burned the lungs. Evan straightened and said, "Want to go for a walk?" I nodded and we started up the familiar trail. Snow crunching under our boots, the world around us covered in white and pine and stillness. Halfway up the ridge, he stopped. "Clara, do you remember this spot?" I looked around and the memory hit me. The tree, the slope, the echo of wind through the rocks. "Yes, this is where I found you." He nodded, his breath trembling just slightly, like the memory pressed too close. "Last year I thought the storm would be my last thought," he said, voice low and steady. "Then I heard you shouting, 'Hey, can you hear me?'" He tried to smile, but his eyes glistened a little. "You were the first person in years who called out to me because you wanted to, not because of what I could give back." I stepped closer, snow brushing my boots. "I did not know you were a billionaire when I dragged you out of the snow." Evan shook his head. "You saved me twice, once from the storm and once from the life that kept me frozen in place." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in a leather cord. When he opened his hand, it was the old compass I had returned to him months ago. The last thing his grandfather left him, the first thing he had left behind for me when he disappeared. Evan said this compass has pointed north my whole life, but lately it has only pointed to one place. I blinked confused until he stepped closer, placed the compass gently into my palm and said, "Home. Clara for me is wherever you are." My breath caught, he continued. "I left the company for good. Last month. I do not plan on going back. I bought land near the base of the mountain. I want to build something real. I want a life that feels honest one, where I wake up next to someone who reminds me that goodness still exists." His voice wavered, but never broke. "I want to stay here with you. Not because I need saving, but because I finally understand peace, and peace is you." The wind swept across the ridge, scattering loose snow like tiny silver sparks. He hesitated, then asked Clara, "Can I stay?" I stared at him. This man who had walked away from skyscrapers and shareholders and all the things people chase their entire lives to stand here in the quiet with me, asking for nothing more than a life built from warmth and effort and shared breath. I felt something inside me bloom, the kind of feeling you only get when the world has broken you and healed you and whispered, "You can choose again." I reached up, touched his cheek, cold under my fingers, and said, "You already stayed." Evan closed his eyes, then wrapped his arms around me, burying his face into my shoulder. The mountain wind circled us, but for the first time it felt like it carried blessing, not warning when we walked back down the ridge hand in hand. Evening settling softly, the cabin flickered with firelight, windows glowing gold through the falling snow. Our home, we stepped inside, shedding the cold. Evan hung his coat on the peg next to mine, as if it had always belonged there. And as we stood in the doorway, I felt it a calm deeper than any storm could ever break. Evan turned to me, whispering almost like a vow, "You saved a stranger that night, Clara, but you also saved the man." I did not know how to become. I rested my forehead against his and said softly, "You saved me too." The snow kept falling outside, soft, steady, gentle, like the world finally understood. We were no longer lost. We were found together. If this story touched your heart, even for a moment, if there was a line that made you breathe a little deeper, or a scene that made your chest tighten like someone had quietly touched the softest part of your soul, then please do not leave just yet, because there is something I want to tell you. If you have ever saved someone with a small act of kindness, if you have ever walked through the storms of your own life feeling invisible, if you have ever helped someone without expecting anything in return, if you have ever looked at your own scars and wondered why your story had to hurt so much, then you are the reason these stories exist. People across America, especially those who have lived long enough to know loss, heartbreak, disappointment, and unexpected grace. They do not watch stories like this just for entertainment. They watch because they need to remember that goodness still exists. They watch to believe that someone somewhere can look at them without judgment. They watch because sometimes the coldest winters of our lives lead us straight into the warmest homes. If there was a moment in this story that stung, that is because you have lived deeply. If it made you cry, it is because your heart never hardened. even when life tried to freeze it if it made you smile. That is the quiet miracle we hope to bring to you every time we tell a story. These stories are not fairy tales. They are written for people who have loved, lost, rebuilt, forgiven, and kept their kindness even when the world gave them every reason to let it go. And if you are still here listening now, then you are part of that rare community, a community of people who still choose compassion in a world that moves too fast. You can walk away right now and live the rest of your life never hearing from us again. But if you believe the world needs more stories that heal, if you believe there are still hearts out there that need a hand to hold, if you believe a single story can lift someone out of their darkest day, then I am asking you to stay with us. Please like this video if it stirred something inside you, share it with someone you care about. If you want to give them a bit of warmth and hope, comment even one simple sentence. I'm here, so we know you are someone who still believes in the goodness of people, and if you want more stories that bring light into the heavy places of life, stories that do not shout or pretend but speak gently to the bruised parts of the heart, then subscribe to this channel right now, because we are not just posting videos. We are building a home, a place for hearts that have been hurt, a place for people who have carried burdens quietly, a place where you never have to feel alone again. Every new story will be a small candle just for you, something to soften the hard days and remind you that winter never lasts forever. And if no one has told you this in a long time, let me say it to you now. You have done enough. You deserve peace, you deserve love, you deserve to be seen and remembered. If you are ready for a journey of stories that help you believe in people again, then subscribe right now, because the next story we tell is already waiting for you.